Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Farahnaz Ispahani, who served as a member of the National Assembly of Pakistan between 2008 and 2012. She's also a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute, co-chair of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, and a public policy scholar with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Also joining us, Michael Kugelman. He's the deputy director of the Asia program, where he also serves as senior associate for South Asia. Michael also writes a regular column for Foreign Policy's weekly South Asia Brief. And Michael, that's the tip of the iceberg. You are quite prolific and your work can be found all over media. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to be here as always.
So they join us today to talk about their early observations of life under Taliban rule in Afghanistan. And let's begin generally, and we can dig deeper on some of the specifics. But Farahnaz, let's get your just general thoughts. Is it, if the scale is worse than you feared, better than you hoped, or maybe just about what you expected, what is your read of the early days?
My read is it's exactly what I feared. And it's Taliban regime 2. And we already see and hear stories of women not being allowed to go to schools, beheadings of religious minorities, and a state of fear for all of those who either were affiliated or worked for the US Army or the former government of President Ghani or President Karzai. So the mood is depressed and depressing.
Michael, do you have anything different that you've observed?
No, unfortunately, I completely agree with Farahnaz. And, we knew this was coming because, as you'll recall, well before the Taliban takeover, the Taliban controlled a lot of territory. And there was, we were starting to hear reports and reportage analysis from these areas of Taliban control that suggested that the Taliban really had not moved on at all from the way in which it governed back in the 1990s. So it's really is a very troubling state of affairs, but a wholly unsurprising state of affairs as well.
Also want to get both of your thoughts on this notion of how we should think about or talk about the Taliban, right? Are they a government? Are they a tribe? Are they tribal warlords? How should we think and talk about them?
I'll jump in to say, I referred to them a few minutes ago as the Taliban regime because I can't acknowledge them as a government because they were not democratically elected in any way, but they are in power right now and are controlling the situation. So that is basically, this is 40% of Afghanistan's population, the Pashtun Sunnis who make up the Taliban, and they're in control through force. And so I would say regime.
Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a group, of course, that emerged from the Mujahideen fighters taking on the Soviets back in the 1980s. They evolved into the Taliban. And of course, they managed to take over a fair amount of territory in Afghanistan in the 90s. At one point, they controlled 90% of the country. And they were in control for a few years before being removed by US forces in 2001. But this is a group that has never been designated as a terrorist organization by the US government, but you have factions within the Taliban that have, such as the Haqqani network, which is clearly a terrorist organization. I would describe the Taliban on the whole as a terrorist organization because what has it done for so many years? It's killed many people. But one could also call it an insurgency because it was fighting the Afghan government for some time. But indeed, I would describe it as a regime, as Farah does, because it has taken power. Clearly not, it didn't come to power through an election. There wasn't really a transition of power either. It waltzed into Kabul without having to fire a bullet. But there was no clear formal transfer of power. And I think that it's going to be a long time before you see a critical mass of countries around the world extend formal recognition to the Taliban government.
Farahnaz, one of the countries that is encouraging something like normal relations is Pakistan. And also we've seen Qatar suggesting that they're in power, the world should deal with them. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a practical aspect to this?
Well, I'll just start off by saying the last time the Taliban were in power, 3 countries recognized them: Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. This time around, you notice that Pakistan's still there, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not. So now it's Qatar and Pakistan, and the early signs, maybe some of the stans may jump in, some people in the Middle East, but Pakistan's role, as Michael was saying, goes back to the time with the United States, the Mujahideen, who were created to fight the Soviet, at that time, occupation of Afghanistan, and Pakistan had a great deal to fight, to train the fighters, the Taliban, as they became the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban. But I am extremely concerned. I am a Pakistani by birth, and I'm extremely concerned that Pakistan's overt involvement with the Haqqani network, who they gave shelter in Pakistan all these years, the 20 years that the US and NATO troops have been in Afghanistan. Pakistan sheltered the Haqqani network, who Michael just mentioned, as a terrorist group. And today, the Haqqani network has come out as the strongest element in this new Taliban regime. So Pakistan's role is very disturbing. And for me, I look at this, it's not going to be positive for Pakistan. I see blowback coming for Pakistan and Pakistanis.
Michael, will Pakistan respond to this blowback?
Well, I think that for Pakistan, it does have some concerns. On the one hand, Pakistan received what it has always wanted, or what it has long wanted, and that is for there to be a pro-Pakistan government in Afghanistan. That has not been the case for nearly 20 years since the Taliban was removed from power. I do think, when Farahnaz uses the word blowback, I agree with that use of the word. For me, I think of it in the context of the heightened security risks for Pakistan. Certainly what the Taliban did, well, there's 2 things that happened. The Taliban took over in Afghanistan, so it basically won, and US forces left. Both of those developments are things that have really galvanized Islamist militants in Afghanistan and beyond, including a group that has staged huge numbers of attacks in Pakistan over the years, that being the Pakistani Taliban, a different group from the Afghan Taliban, but still a group that is ideologically similar to the Afghan Taliban and that has actually partnered with the Afghan Taliban in staging attacks in Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban is a group that had been degraded in terms of its power in recent years after Pakistani counterterrorism offensives, but it had been showing signs of a resurgence, particularly after it got a new leader over the several years ago, and it's been galvanized in a big way. And already we've seen, since the Taliban takeover, the number of attacks carried out by the Pakistani Taliban in Pakistan have been very high. We're talking about 30 attacks alone in the month of August, which is a lot. And these are mainly in rural areas along the border with Afghanistan, but you could be sure that the Pakistani authorities are concerned about this threat. And what Pakistan wants to do is to try to pressure the Taliban in Afghanistan to deny space to the Pakistani Taliban, which is based in Afghanistan. But that's not going to be easy for the Pakistanis to do in terms of pressuring the Taliban in Afghanistan to do that. So very real security risks for Pakistan now.
I'll just jump in here. I have a slight difference of view to Michael on his last statement, because we clearly saw the head of Pakistan's intelligence services arrive in Kabul when the Taliban were having all of this infighting about who was going to head the new government and steer it. And it was between mainly the Mullah Baradar group, who led the talks in Doha with the US and was a visible figure. And the US thought it was going to be Mullah Baradar and his slightly more moderate group that would win. But once the ISI chief came from Pakistan, he had talks. As soon as he left, there was a major confrontation between the Haqqanis and Mullah Baradar. And next thing we see is that the government is clearly in the hands of the Haqqani group. So there seems to be a definite linkage. Many analysts have linked the two. So I think it's important to bring that into the equation. For blowback for me is how it will affect the Pakistani people and also the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, as Michael was saying, and also obviously this Haqqani group, very tough, very dangerous terrorists who are now going to be running Taliban. Because, as I said before, everyone who worked for the last civilian elected government, everyone who worked with NATO or any of the other forces, including aid agencies and NGOs, these people are now on hit lists. And let's talk about 50% of the population women. And let's talk about the Hazara Shias, who are roughly between 10 and 15% of the population, and all of the other minorities. We are going to see, just like we saw in Pakistan with the Pakistani Taliban, the same kind of targeted murders, amputations, beheadings, the blowing up of their places of worship, and much worse. And that is where my concern is today.
Are there external pressures that this version that you just described of the Taliban will respond to? I mean, there are practical considerations when it comes to just food and medicine and general supplies that a nation needs. Is there any hope that those external pressures can force more moderation than might be the instinct of the people who are in charge?
Well, the problem here is really what the United States has done. With the Doha deal, they did not ask for women's rights or democracy or minority rights or anything. They basically handed Afghanistan to the Taliban. And because of that, obviously the United States, now President Biden, has made clear, we're not just interested, but I don't think we're going to have a really big stake in this. Other countries may have reasons, like China, who wants to exploit natural resources, for example, in Afghanistan. They may have reasons to then supply other things. But the Afghan government, I've seen a UN report which says by the end of this year, 97% of Afghanistan's population is going to be living below the poverty line. So it's a bad thing, but I think Michael can speak to this in greater detail about other countries.
Yeah, I think that one of the big questions moving forward is what type of leverage will the international community have, particularly the West and certainly the US. I don't think we should overstate the leverage that the US is going to have. The biggest tool of leverage that the US had over the Taliban was its troop presence. And of course, that's now gone. And some have argued that the U.S. could dangle the possibility of more assistance or significant amounts of assistance and the removal of sanctions on the Taliban government if it were to provide assurances on X, Y, and Z. And X, Y, and Z, you typically referring to assurances of human rights, assurances of more inclusivity in the government, assurances that terrorists in Afghanistan are being dealt with. I don't think that's something that the U.S. will succeed with in a big way. As Farahnaz and I have both indicated, there's no reason to believe that the fundamental worldview and ideology of the Taliban has changed. So there's no reason to think that the Taliban is suddenly going to indicate that it's going to become like a Jeffersonian democracy in terms of how it supports rights and particularly the rights of women, that type of thing. Also, I think the Taliban will bank on the fact that there will be other countries, not in the West, including some countries in the region like Pakistan, China, Russia, others, that would not be looking for assurances of human rights as a condition for providing recognition and the foreign assistance that comes with that. So I imagine that the Taliban believes that it'll be able to get foreign assistance, which it really wants, from enough countries where it doesn't have to worry about trying to appease the United States in order to give the US what it wants so that the Taliban can get foreign assistance. So that's why I think that this notion of leverage, as it plays out here in the US with the Taliban, I think we have to be very cautious about those types of comments.
So as you both describe it, there's no scenario where the Taliban aspires to and becomes a legitimate government that is part of the international community. Fair?
Well,
Is that a fair conclusion based on what you said?
I mean, the Taliban believes it already is a legitimate government. It has been since the end of 2001. I mean, you saw recently that the Taliban asked that it be able to address the UN General Assembly meetings as the rightful representative of the Afghan government. But no, yes, my point is that certainly there are things that the Taliban will want to do to get a modicum of legitimacy and recognition from enough countries. And I think there, what we could see from the Taliban are renewed commitments to target the ISIS Khorasan terror group, which has always been a rival of the Taliban. Unlike most of the terror groups in Afghanistan, the Taliban has already been actually fighting against ISIS Khorasan. And so I think you'll see repeated messaging from the Taliban indicating, yes, we are committed to denying space to terrorist organizations. Look at what we're doing with ISIS Khorasan. But they'll be very significantly, they're not going to say the same thing about Al-Qaeda, which is the group that it's very close to. So in other words, I think that there'll be some token gestures, some token messaging from the Taliban suggesting that it's going to be a responsible, legitimate actor. But there's a lot that it's not going to do for sure.
Farahnaz, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to put out the reality of what I would say Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad and all of those who negotiated in Doha are responsible for, okay? Because I think we keep going away from the human aspects of this. And this is a very human tragedy. In the first 6 months of this year, there have been over 20 incidents of attacks, beheadings, murders of Shia Hazara communities all over Afghanistan. Already we are hearing of the tiny Christian community that is spread all over, but mainly in the larger towns. They are deleting the Bibles that they have on their phones. They are burning the physical Bibles. They are disappearing out of sight, out of mind. Women already. 20 years. President Bush, well, they're all responsible in a way going back to Obama, but President Biden said, oh, we spent $2 trillion there. Well, in those 2 decades, there's a whole new generation of women, religious minorities, and other Afghans, educated professional people who were our best hope for the future of that country. The women are now mainly at home. There are reprisals against all the educated women, the women who held political roles, educators, lawyers, judges. And because of the US presence there, all of these people felt they could get out there and play a part in changing their countries. So, we cannot forget, we cannot talk about this like a normal change of power. It is not. And for any country which accepts, except for countries which are authoritarian in nature, like China and Russia, or maybe some of the countries in the Stans who I mentioned earlier, any country from the so-called civilized, democratic world that accepts this government is going to have a lot of blood on their hands. And I want people to remember that while they're talking about ISIS, Khorasan, and the Taliban, and what the West should be worried about. We have blood on our hands. And if we think we're going to shore up the Taliban again to fight ISIS Khorasan, it's going to be a huge mistake. Yesterday, the FBI director said at a hearing on the Hill, he said that the Taliban's reemergence in power is going to lead to an escalation of domestic attacks in the United States. All over the Muslim world, all over social media, a lot of Islamist extremist groups are seeing this, the Taliban victory, as a huge defeat of the United States and a huge victory for them. So the FBI director said on record yesterday in front of Congress that we have to be very wary. He expects increased attacks on US soil.
Given everything that both of you have spoken about, and Farahnaz, I completely appreciate you putting the human suffering front and center in this discussion. And with that in mind, keeping that front and center, what are the best options moving forward for any nation in the world or any group of people in the world who would try to support those women that are now finding themselves in this untenable situation after hope that was part of their lives previously, or any of the suffering that we're seeing, on the ground among the populace? What are the best options? Are there any options available?
Frankly, I don't think so, because this is so deeply ingrained in what the Taliban believe. And then in those areas where you have ISIS Khorasan, they are even harsher in their belief systems. So, to them, a Muslim who's converted to Christianity is someone who should be killed. I mean, that is a clear belief of the form of Sharia they believe in. So I don't see much at this point. This is why I keep going back to Doha. What was done in Doha is going to be a historic, a death knell to any rights in Afghanistan. I can't see the Europeans saying, oh, don't let the Afghan ambassador speak, at the UN or any of these things, actually changing things on the ground. It didn't the last time round. And I'm very pessimistic, perhaps because it's a neighboring country, perhaps because I know a lot of Afghan women and religious minorities, and just those Afghans who have cared about civil society. I am not optimistic.
Michael, final thoughts.
Yeah, so I think it's important to keep in mind sort of sobering truth here is that human rights was never really on formal official levels a major objective for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. It was never in Afghanistan to promote human rights. I mean, the first objective was counterterrorism oriented, remove the Al-Qaeda sanctuaries. And then more recently, counterterrorism became the main focus as well as the threat of ISIS Khorasan emerged. In the middle part of much of the last 20 years, the U.S. really struggled to articulate a clear strategy for why it was in Afghanistan. Certainly, there may have been some lip service put out there about the need to promote human rights and women's rights, but that was never, in my view, a major objective of U.S. forces, even though one could argue
it wasn't their objective, but their presence made the Afghans who were brave enough. Just the presence made these Afghans stand up.
Absolutely.
Get out there. Women governors were gunned down, massacred. I mean, you saw the Afghans themselves took the repercussions, but it was just knowing that US and NATO forces were there. I'm certainly not saying that was a US mission, but it was the presence.
Absolutely. No, this is very true. And certainly there were many gains that were made over the last 20 years, particularly for women, access to education, access to healthcare and employment and so on. But to your question, very briefly, John, what can be done? At a minimum, the U.S. needs to continue to do whatever is necessary to get those Afghans eligible for the special immigrant visas, those Afghans that had worked with the U.S. military. Efforts need to be made to get them out of Afghanistan. Secondly, humanitarian assistance. You don't need to have formal relations with the Taliban in order to talk to the Taliban and engage with the Taliban to ensure that they will allow for humanitarian supplies to be delivered into Afghanistan and safe passage for aid workers bringing the assistance in. I'd like to think that the Taliban won't cause too many problems in that regard. I certainly hope that I'm not wrong. But, again, there certainly are ways that the U.S. could try to engage with the Taliban in ways that fall short of recognition to ensure that those that need help will get it and that those that desperately want to leave the country are able to get out. Very tough, but I think those have to be Washington's objectives, at least at this point.
Well, if Washington's going to probably either speak through Pakistan or other neighboring countries, because in and of itself, it has little credibility. But there are other countries like, let's say, Iran and China and Russia, not US allies, who may be willing to do as Michael has said. But let's see.
We'll take a little hope wherever we can get it. It's really a dire circumstance. And thanks to both of you for your clear-eyed analysis and helping us understand what's happening.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon on. Till then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.